So that leads me to the myths of Lyme disease. And I see I have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Now, the chief myth is that we can diagnose Lyme disease. This is a bar chart basically showing the performance of the Lyme disease test at various stages. And we can see very early on, even if you are infected, there's a very low chance, or too low a chance, that you will test positive. About 50% of people in the first weeks to maybe month or two of the infection will actually have Lyme disease, but they'll test negative. It's not a very good test, and we can't rely on it. It cannot distinguish current from past infection, which may lead your doctor to say, oh, you already were infected. Even though this test is positive, I'm not going to treat you for Lyme disease. It's a false positive. There's been a lot of concern among doctors over false positives. And the reason is, you go to the scientific literature, you're going to find 30 papers on overdiagnosis of Lyme disease and 5 or 6 on underdiagnosis, which is really the more serious problem. This quote that it's complex, technically demanding, difficult to interpret, that's from a government scientist. It's very arbitrary. It gets better, you'll see by that chart later on, but that's based on studies that you really can't trust. A group of European scientists looked at 78 studies. They found there wasn't sufficient evidence to make inferences about the value of the tests. In other words, we can't say that they work. Here's one reason, among many, that this really matters. This is a 17-year-old boy. From Dutchess County, who had gone away to summer camp, came home sick. He also came home really fired up to be an environmentalist and a natural scientist because it was an environmental camp. His parents took him to the pediatrician twice. He was tested for Lyme disease. He tested negative, wrongly. The Lyme disease spirochete went to his heart. It caused Lyme cardinitis, or heart block, basically, and he died. This is a quote from a lawsuit in which his pediatrician is asking, what's the significance to you of the fact that the antibody test was negative? The doctor replies that he didn't have Lyme at the time. This is what doctors believe, at least some of them. Now, they say this kind of situation is rare. And when I wrote this story, in all of the medical literature, there had only been reported 4 cases of Lyme carditis. Guess what? 5 months later, there's another death in Dutchess County. Nobody's looking for this kind of thing. They also tell us, okay, you have the rash. So if you don't test positive early on, you'll get the rash. The rash is called a bullseye rash. In about 9% of cases, it's actually a bullseye, this central clearing with the red on the outside. So it often can be missed. You sometimes don't get it either. Best case, 70 to 80% of people do get the rash. So it's, again, this paradigm on which Lyme diagnosis and treatment rest is flawed. And this is some of the ways in which it's flawed. Now, I told you about Borrelia burgdorferi. It's a pretty nasty organism, and it's been around a long time, and it has learned how to survive. It is a champion survivor. The first thing it does is it does that little drilling deal. It disseminates throughout your body. It goes to your lymph nodes, and it disables germinal centers. These are things that your lymph nodes need to fight off infection. We've found this in mice, and we found this in monkeys, and there's every reason to believe it's happening in people. It also changes itself. It's got these outer surface proteins, they're called, and your immune system looks at them and says, okay, I gotcha, I'm going to start attacking that thing. And then it sheds those proteins, and it takes on another look, and your immune system is like, what? What's going on? It also, when it's under environmental stress, namely our immune system is attacking it or antibiotics are attacking it, it does these things. It changes shape. It goes dormant, goes under these things called biofilms, and it just hangs out there until the coast is clear. It persists. Borrelia is a really, really interesting microorganism. This was told to me by a University of California scientist. It has a huge brain. It outsmarts people. So now I'm going to go through, we can cure Lyme disease, and then I'm going to take some questions. Now, it has been said for a long time that a short course of antibiotics is all that is needed. Say 10 to 28 days, and that spirochete is killed in your body. So this is a recent study that sort of reaffirms that. This guy, Dr. Gary Wormser, who is a leading champion of Lyme disease dogma, took patients and gave them 14 days of amoxicillin because they had Lyme rash. He knew they had Lyme disease. He found it to be highly effective and well tolerated, uniformly successful in resolving the rash. No patient, Dr. Wormser writes, developed an objective manifestation of Lyme disease. Remember that word, objective. And yet, there was evidence of what we call post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome in nearly 17% of these 24 people. In other words, they stayed sick. And you know, for years and years, it's been in the medical literature, 10 to 20% of people, this is from the CDC, treated with 2 to 4 weeks of antibiotics will have lingering symptoms. That amounts to 42 to 84,000 people in 2017. There was one study that found 15 years later, 5% of those people would still be sick. So compound those numbers year after year, and then consider this is among people who are treated early, who have the best opportunity and hope to get better, the best chance. People who are treated later, the numbers are much higher in terms of them still suffering. So a little bit about these people who continue to suffer, life after Lyme. One scientist at Columbia University likened it to congestive heart failure. That's the kind of quality of life of some people with post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, whatever that is. Another study of 63 patients found them with all sorts of, neurocognitive problems. Namely, I can't remember things. I have brain fog. I also have task problems doing normal things every day, problems making my body move the way it should move, fatigue, sleep disturbance, a lot of pain. And this may help explain why. On the left, we have the brains of normal people. On the right, we have brains of people who are suffering from post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. And basically what we're seeing, and this is a pretty new study from Johns Hopkins, it's massive inflammation in people's heads. So a lot of those other, things, the fatigue, the sleeplessness, I can't remember things, those are the subjective symptoms that have long been dismissed and why this disease hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. This is just sort of a summary of some of the problems that persist with Lyme disease. And I think I'll end it here so we can talk a little bit. We have based Lyme disease care and our hesitance, so to speak, to doing longer courses of Lyme disease, of antibiotics, based on about 4 clinical trials. In other words, we've taken people who have lingering Lyme disease in 4 different experiments, and we've given them 3 months of antibiotics. First of all, that's not enough studies to really mean anything. And there have been criticisms of those studies. They didn't have enough people involved. They minimized the positive effects, and they expected much more improvement. In other words, in one of the studies, you had to be a whole standard deviation better in terms of your functioning than the general population to be counted as a success story. Further, they did the same thing over and over. 3 months of a combination of oral and intravenous antibiotics. If it didn't work the first time, we got to try something else. But instead, there's been this cheerleading going on. See, it's not a chronic illness. This didn't work in these cases. Okay, and the problem here shows why we're in this situation. Compared to other illnesses, we have had very, very little study of what works for people with Lyme disease. You can see at the bottom there, Lyme disease has very, very few studies. HIV/AIDS, more than 600. We haven't done the work on Lyme disease. We have a lot more to do to figure out why people stay sick, how to make them better. And we have to recognize that people stay sick and it's not something that's in their heads. And we're starting to document that with studies like those brain scans, with other studies that are going on now about the persistence in animals. And we're moving in the right direction. A couple of weeks ago, a bill passed in Congress to provide $150 million for tick-borne illnesses. That's huge. That's more money than we've seen in a very long time. But we have a lot more to do.